Can we expect something in regards to sectoral tariffs?
That was just a brilliant segue there,
tried,
Judy. Very good. We'll see. We're ongoing discussions with the Americans, and I wouldn't overplay it. I'm looking forward to see the president at APEC in Korea.
When Prime Minister Mark Carney confirmed the possibility of a sectoral tariff deal with the United States, it was a signal of strategy, a deliberate shift in how Canada faces the world's most aggressive trade agenda. Instead of chasing a single, sweeping trade agreement, Carney is carving out targeted sectoral arrangements that protect the industries Canada values most. This approach comes at a time when the Trump administration is tightening its grip on foreign imports and warning allies to reshore or pay more. For months, U.S. tariffs have rippled through global markets, reshaping supply chains and straining alliances. But in Ottawa, the effect has been different. Rather than retreat, Canada is adapting, and in doing so, turning Trump's trade war into a chance to rebuild on its own terms.
We have the best deal with the Americans of any country. We have the lowest tariff on our automobiles and trucks of any country, but we are not satisfied. That is why we are negotiating a new accord on steel, on aluminum, on energy, and on auto.
Behind Carney's confirmation of a sectoral deal lies a deeper strategy, refusing to let Washington dictate the rules. By negotiating within specific industries, steel, aluminum, and energy, Ottawa is taking control over what matters most to its economy. Unlike a broad agreement that binds every sector, a targeted deal gives Canada flexibility. It allows Ottawa to defend core national interests without surrendering leverage to the White House. This is not a return to old-style diplomacy, where Canada waited for the U.S. to set the tone. It is an acknowledgement that the North American relationship has fundamentally changed. Trade researchers point out that such an approach mirrors the reality of 2025, a fragmented global economy where power depends on specialization and resilience. For Canada, steel and aluminum remain vital. Together, these industries employ nearly 100,000 Canadians and anchor regional economies from Hamilton to Saguenay. Carney's move also shields energy exports, a sector worth more than 130 billion Canadian dollars in 2024, according to Statistics Canada, from the volatility of U.S. tariff threats. In other words, sectoral negotiation is not a compromise. It is an insurance policy for Canada's industrial backbone. As Trump's team boasts about reshoring jobs, Canada is quietly writing a new rulebook, one where sovereignty and selectivity go hand in hand.
But the shift goes deeper than trade tactics. It reflects a broader national pivot toward economic independence. In recent weeks, Canadian analysts have urged a new focus on value-added production, making more at home and exporting smarter. That message is taking hold. In the wake of auto layoffs in Ontario, where factories in Brampton and Ingersoll have closed or downsized, the federal government has emphasized rebuilding manufacturing capacity through public-private cooperation. It's not just about saving jobs, it's about reinventing the structure of Canadian industry. Government data shows that the manufacturing sector still accounts for nearly 10% of Canada's GDP, supporting over 1.7 million workers. But global competition and U.S. tariffs have exposed the risks of dependence. Trump's policies, meant to weaken Canada's export position, are instead driving Ottawa to double down on domestic production and long-term resilience. The message from the government is clear. Every tariff that blocks a border crossing will be met with new incentives to produce at home. From clean energy investment to local sourcing requirements, Canada's industrial map is changing. The goal is not isolation. It is stability. Trump's economic wall has unintentionally helped Canada discover its own foundation.
While debates continue in Washington, Carney's eyes are looking east. His upcoming 10-day trip to Asia, confirmed by government sources, aims to strengthen Canada's trade outreach beyond North America.
It's a move that even critics admit is well-timed. Asia now represents one of the fastest-growing destinations for Canadian exports, led by markets like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India. According to Global Affairs Canada, bilateral trade with the Indo-Pacific region surpassed 230 billion Canadian dollars in 2024, an increase of more than 15% from the previous year. By engaging Asian partners directly, Carney is pursuing both diversification and influence. The plan aligns with Ottawa's Team Canada trade strategy, which focuses on building alliances with democracies that share interests in sustainable growth, digital infrastructure, and energy transition. For a country long tied to the U.S. market, this shift is monumental. It sends a clear message. Canada will no longer wait for the White House to open the door. It will chart its own course across the Pacific, where demand for food, minerals, and clean energy is growing fast. This Asia strategy is not a reaction to Trump. It's a replacement for dependency. It positions Canada as a middle power with global reach, no longer defined by the policies of its southern neighbor. Amid all the talk of tariffs and trade, Carney's leadership has kept a human face on economic policy. His government's response to recent job losses in Ontario shows that trade strategy cannot be separated from social responsibility. At the federal and provincial levels, discussions are underway to provide expanded unemployment benefits, mental health programs, and retraining for displaced workers. These measures are not dramatic headlines, but they matter to families affected by the shifting economy. This balance between diplomacy abroad and compassion at home is shaping Carney's image as a pragmatic leader. While Trump rallies crowds with slogans about dominance and victory, Carney speaks through action, reinforcing industries, supporting workers, and steering Canada toward steady growth. In a climate of global volatility, that steadiness resonates. It reminds Canadians that leadership is not about noise, but endurance. The irony of Trump's trade war is becoming clear. His tariffs were meant to corner allies, yet they are pushing them to adapt faster than ever. For Canada, the pressure has become motivation to modernize, diversify, and strengthen from within. What began as an attempt to make Canada bend is turning into proof of resilience. The concept of a sectoral deal no longer sounds like surrender, but strategy. It reflects a country that refuses to be boxed in by another nation's politics. As global markets adjust to this new reality, one truth stands out. Trump's economic firewalls have failed to contain Canada. Instead, they have sparked a transformation that may outlast his entire trade agenda. While Washington builds barriers, Ottawa is building balance. And in that balance lies the quiet strength of a nation that has learned how to stand tall, even in the shadow of its most powerful neighbor.
After months of back and forth, the U.S. and Canada appear to be making progress toward a trade deal.
There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
In Washington, the mood was serious. Cameras caught Prime Minister Mark Carney walking up the steps of the White House, returning for his second high-stakes meeting with President Donald Trump. It wasn't a routine visit. It was a test.
It was a conversation broached by the Prime Minister about the Keystone XL pipeline, which is a pipeline many Canadians are probably familiar with.
Carney had come to talk trade, but what surprised observers was the card he placed on the table. In the middle of a tense conversation over tariffs, he raised the prospect of reviving the long-dead Keystone XL pipeline, a project once buried under years of political battles in both countries. The move caught attention because Keystone is not just a pipeline. It represents the push and pull between two economic visions: Trump's drive for energy dominance and Carney's attempt to secure relief from punishing tariffs.
Canada is still facing a 50% duty on its steel and aluminum, a measure Trump believes will make America stronger. Yet behind the symbolism of that handshake in the Oval Office lies a different reality. Those same tariffs are now starting to weaken the very supply chains that keep North American industries alive. By putting Keystone back into the discussion, Carney reframed the entire relationship. He wasn't asking for favors. He was reminding Washington that energy security in the United States still depends on Canadian cooperation. Trump's trade playbook relies on one simple idea: economic pressure brings results. His administration has used sweeping tariffs since early 2025, including the 10% blanket tax on most imports and a 50% tariff on Canadian metals. The goal was to drive production back to U.S. factories and force trading partners to concede better terms. But as months passed, that strategy began to turn inward. Reports from the Wharton budget model in April showed rising input costs across American manufacturing centers. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio, both dependent on Canadian aluminum and steel, were paying up to 18% more for raw materials than a year earlier. Construction companies in Pennsylvania complained about shortages that delayed projects and raised prices. At the same time, energy firms found themselves caught in another bind. U.S. refineries rely heavily on the heavy crude that comes from Alberta. Without it, they have to import from faraway suppliers in Venezuela or the Middle East. Transportation costs alone make that crude 20 to 25% more expensive, according to data compiled by the U.S. Energy Information Administration in mid-2025. Carney's team understood this dynamic. Instead of confronting Trump directly, they introduced an option that could solve both sides' problems: expand access to Canadian oil in exchange for a more balanced tariff framework. The idea wasn't a public demand, it was leverage. If Washington wants a stable energy stream, it must treat Canada as an equal partner. That shift in tone changed the equation. Trump's tariffs were meant to squeeze Canada, but by autumn 2025, the strain was landing squarely on U.S. consumers and industries. The more Washington tried to pressure its neighbor, the more it exposed its own dependence.
Donald Trump brought it back in his first iteration as president and still likes it. As recently as last spring, was talking about wanting to get it going again. Mark Carney obviously put this on the table for the president as an idea. The president, we're told, was receptive to it.
To understand the weight of Carney's proposal, it helps to recall what Keystone means in the history of North American politics. The pipeline has been debated for over 15 years, spanning 4 U.S. presidencies. It was canceled by Barack Obama over environmental concerns, revived by Donald Trump during his first term, and canceled again by Joe Biden on his first day in office. By October 2025, most believed Keystone was gone for good. Even its original developer, TC Energy, had walked away. But Carney brought it back into the conversation, not as a construction plan, but as a signal. It reminded the White House that Canada's energy resources are not just commodities, they are part of a shared infrastructure that powers both economies. Reviving the pipeline would allow the U.S. to replace expensive foreign imports with oil from a trusted neighbor. It would also ease political pressure in Alberta, where provincial leaders have long pushed for a route that bypasses British Columbia's environmental resistance. For Carney, the mention of Keystone solved multiple problems at once. It offered economic logic, domestic symbolism, and a subtle diplomatic challenge. If Trump accepted, he could claim a win for American energy independence. If he refused, he would have to explain why the U.S. preferred unstable foreign suppliers over secure Canadian flows. In that sense, Carney had turned a controversial project into a quiet test of leadership. Reports from Ottawa later confirmed that the U.S. president was receptive to the idea. No promises were made, but the discussion itself shifted the balance of power. For the first time since Trump reimposed tariffs, Canada had something the U.S. wanted badly enough to keep the talks going. Back in Washington, the optics looked familiar: a handshake, some laughter, and talk of progress. But beneath the surface, the trade dynamic had changed. Trump's tariffs were supposed to prove that America could dictate terms. Instead, they exposed the limits of unilateral power. Throughout 2025, U.S. trade data painted a sobering picture. The Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that American exports fell by 3.4% in the second quarter, largely because of retaliatory measures and higher input costs. Domestic manufacturing output slowed, while consumer prices rose in sectors dependent on imported materials. What began as a show of strength was turning into a feedback loop of higher costs and diplomatic friction. For Trump, the political calculus is shifting too. Midwestern governors and industry groups, once loyal allies, are calling for targeted tariff relief, especially on Canadian goods. They argue that the tariffs are no longer protecting jobs but threatening them. Carney, meanwhile, kept his tone measured. He returned to Ottawa without declarations of victory. His message was short, the meetings were productive, and dialogue would continue. Yet that restraint spoke volumes. It suggested that Canada no longer played defense. It had learned to turn Trump's tactics into opportunity. As fall deepens, both nations now face a test of endurance. The next phase of talks will decide whether the tariffs remain or evolve into a broader North American energy pact. But one outcome is already visible. The pressure that once cornered Canada has begun to circle back toward the United States. The trade war that started as a show of dominance has become a study in interdependence. And the pipeline that once symbolized division now stands as a reminder that economic strength in North America still runs in both directions. Because in the end, power built on pressure alone never lasts. The handshake in Washington was more than a diplomatic gesture. It was the moment the U.S. realized that leverage cuts both ways.